Welcome to the Lift Every Voice podcast, where we explore books by contemplative writers of color. I'm Christine Valters Paintner.
And I'm Claudia Love Mair. We are joined each month by the author of our book club selection. Together, we explore how increasing our diversity of perspectives on contemplative practice can enrich our experience of the Christian mystical tradition.
We encourage you to join us by reading the book, listening to the conversations, and engaging with the reflection questions on our website at abbeyofthearts.com. Welcome, everyone, to our Lift Every Voice book club. I'm delighted to be joined by Claudia Love Mair, my ongoing conversation partner, and also by Dr. and Dean Yolanda Pierce, who wrote this beautiful book, In My Grandmother's House, Black Women, Faith, and the Stories We Inherit. Dr. Pierce is a scholar, writer, womanist, theologian, and accomplished administrator in higher education. She was appointed the founding director of the Center for African American Religious Life at the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture, and she currently serves as professor and dean of the Howard University School of Divinity. Her research specialties include literature and religion, womanist theology, and African American religions. This is her newest book that we're discussing today, and you can also read her essays in the Christian Century, where she's a contributing columnist. So welcome, Dean Pierce. It's wonderful to have you here. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm so happy to join you both today.
It's our pleasure. So I'm going to ask the first question, Dr. Pierce. Dean.
All good.
You're a womanist theologian, and grandmother theology seems to be central in your work. Christine and I have been seeing grandmother wisdom come up in almost all of the conversations that we've had lately. Why are the grannies having their day right now?
I love that the grannies are having their day. The grandmothers, the abuelas, the abuelitas. I love that. That I think has to do with us thinking and taking seriously this idea of generational wisdom, which is that we may know some things, and even our parents may know some things, but the more generations you have as a part of the conversation, the deeper it is, right? The more wisdom that comes to the table. So I hope this is a moment in which we are taking very seriously that our elders have lived through everything we've been through and then some. And there's some wisdom that comes with age, that comes with experience, that comes across those generations. And that for there really to be flourishing, particularly in faith communities, they have to be conversations, it has to be theology that is produced across the generations. So a bunch of 20-year-olds talking to a bunch of 20-year-olds is interesting, right? But it changes the dynamic significantly when the 20-year-olds are talking to the 70-year-olds. So I hope that this is a moment of generational wisdom.
Yes, I love that. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a beautiful, beautiful image. So you obviously talk a lot about your grandparents and how they impacted you, and particularly your grandmother and the church mothers. And you talk about how there was a picture of Black Jesus as a reflection of the divine in their home, and how it helped them to see the divine in them, and also helped them to be in solidarity with those who are marginalized. So I would love to hear more about that, and particularly how Black Jesus helped you to cultivate that kind of awareness for yourself.
I don't know how my grandparents, who literally were from descendants of slavery and sharecroppers, I don't know how they ended up with a Black Jesus on the wall of their house. So I have no backstory. All I know was that all of my life as a child growing up, there were pictures of Martin Luther King, there are pictures of Malcolm X. I mean, this is a tradition within African American homes. You have pictures of family members, but these big iconic cultural figures. There was a picture of Black Jesus. I understood that was Jesus, that Jesus had brown skin, and Jesus had the crown of thorns. Jesus had very curly, textured hair. And so that was the image of Jesus I had always known. What I now realize was that it was such a powerful thing to grow up with the sense of Jesus looked like me and I look like Jesus. I did not have to actually unlearn a certain kind of white supremacy. I didn't have to unlearn that Jesus wasn't white. I never thought that Jesus was white because I never saw a representation of Jesus as white. And so I didn't have to unlearn anything. And what it meant was this community in which I was being raised, an African American community in New York, a church community, a neighborhood, and then later on in my own life, the people around me I knew to be made in the image and likeness of God, but what we call in theology the imago Dei. So I didn't have to deconstruct that. I didn't have to unlearn that. I knew that these brown folks that I was seeing on a regular basis were made in the image and likeness of God. Black Jesus had hair like mine. Black Jesus had skin like mine. And so when I looked at my grandfather, my father, or my friends, or the men that I would go to school with, of course they look like Jesus. It's a really powerful gift to give a child to know that that child is a reflection of the divine and doesn't have to learn that as an adult.
Yeah, that's an incredible gift, particularly in a culture that worships white images of the divine in particular. So
Absolutely.
I appreciate that. That story. Thank you.
Like you, I was formed in Kojic, had the church mamas. I still have a church mother. I am so far from Kojic now. Still got one in my life. She does not think I'm saved. She is praying for me.
I'm sure they're praying for all of us. I know.
But I don't know that this is everyone's experience to have church mothers like that, though I'm sure there are elders that are respected. Could you share with our audience what a church mother is in the Black Pentecostal church and what her role is, especially to young girls and young women?
So within holiness and Pentecostal traditions, there is a church office called the church mother. It is as official as a deacon board or a trustees board or an elders board or whatever official offices that a church may have as part of its governance structure. So in holiness and Pentecostal churches, particularly within the Black tradition, there are church mothers. There is a mother's board. The church mothers have ecclesial responsibilities. So I grew up with this group of elder Black women. They were the church mothers. What I know now is that they ran everything. So when you're growing up, you just think of these as the grandmas and the church mothers. And in our tradition, on Sundays, they often wore white. They usually would sit together. So those are the church mothers, but they ran everything. One of the things that I love to talk about with the church mothers is to say that in a religion like Christianity, which can still be very, very patriarchal, in denominations, especially the one in which I grew up in, where women are not ordained. So the male pastor is really the head and the covering. It's the men whose names are on the marquee outside of the church. Despite that, my actual experience was quite different, which is that these women, in ways big and small, ran everything. Sometimes just a nod of their head or a particular look, everything would shift, right? And so I really grew up with the sense that women in the church were powerful, that they heard from God, that they really had something to do with the running of this ecclesial space. And they were elders. And one of their responsibilities, whether officially or unofficially, was how they were training young women in the church, whether they were related to them by blood or not. The church mothers were often not your relatives. So they took it upon themselves to tell you about how you were dressed and what you were doing and what you shouldn't be doing. There was a lot of what you shouldn't be doing, more of that than anything else. But if we talk about the sense of a village, if we talk about the sense of a community, they took it upon themselves to raise, protect, and teach in the faith the young women who are in the church. This is a beautiful and amazing tradition, which I'm sorry to say is really probably dying out.
It is, it is. My church mom is in her 80s now.
Yeah.
And so back when I was a teenager, she was, I'm almost 60, so she's only 20 years older than me, but she was also formed by other women and taking that mantle on herself. And yeah, I do think that tradition is dying out. And I realize now, I saw them as these powerful, church ladies, but these were women, Black women, who had gone through many, many things. It seemed like they lived their entire life in the church, but they didn't really. And so when they told us about the length of our hem, they were
Always.
protecting us. They were trying to keep us safe because they knew the predators out. And they never said that, hey, don't wear that because,
Right.
a guy will do this. It was always, that is not of the Lord or something of that nature. And I really appreciate that now.
Oh, I do as well. I think it's a dual role that the church mothers had. One of those roles had to do literally with safety, and that's one of the things that I talk about, which is that they were protecting us from the dangers both inside of the church and outside of the church. The predators within and the predators without, and they never used that language. That was not the language that they would have known to use. The language is always biblical, but certainly that was one function. But the second function is a theological function, and which is to say that what I learned about faith, what I learned about prayer, what I learned about the testimony service or the tarry service, what I now know as a theologian was really theology. They were teaching that as well. So they wouldn't have been recognized as theologians. They certainly wouldn't have been recognized as teachers of the church. My church mothers had no formal education or training, the vast majority of them. But I recognize now that I inherit my faith through these powerful women who taught me how to pray, who taught me scripture, who taught me how to go before God, and to really just put a pin on that and take seriously what it means to be formed theologically by a group of women, particularly a group of elder women.
Black women, elder Black
Absolutely.
women. And
Absolutely.
that experience was also central to their lessons.
Yes.
Yeah. I love the subversiveness of that when obviously when you talk about the church, the Christian church is patriarchal, and even where women are ordained, it's still very patriarchal.
Very much so.
And then there are these powerful voices that are still shaping us and you. And you were talking about prayer, so I wanted to hear a little bit more about how your grandmother taught you about prayer. And you have this really beautiful section about describing prayer as contradiction, intercession, celebration, and a primary form of speech. So I wonder if you could just kind of touch on those for us and tell us how your grandmother sort of helped imbue some of that understanding for you.
One of my earliest childhood memories is kneeling with my grandmother at the foot of my tiny little twin bed when I was an adult and would go back and visit. I was like, how did I sleep in a bed this small? It's amazing how small everything was. But at the foot of this bed, I, like many children all over the world, I was taught prayers, and I mention that to say, like, that's a formative memory for me. Like, I can't remember a season in my life where prayer wasn't a part of that because I was taught to pray at such a young age. And connected to that were these more informal ways that I was seeing prayer operate in my household and in my community. My grandmother really prayed without ceasing. I didn't know what that meant. Like, scripture in the Christian tradition talks about praying without ceasing. And I'm just like, I have 50 million things to do today. I have a day job. Like, what is this praying without ceasing, right? But what I saw was that she would be in the kitchen cooking and talking to God, right? We would be doing tasks and chores around the house and cleaning, and she just had this running dialogue, and that intimacy was being modeled before me. So when I think about prayer now, as an adult, as a theologian, as a scholar, I think about prayer as this verbal form of intimacy with God, that it doesn't always require me to stop what I'm doing, kneel, kind of do a whole confession, but this intimacy of talking with a friend and hearing the echoes of the hymn, What a Friend We Have in Jesus, all of my life, right? And so that prayer and the intimacy of it and the regularity of it and the sense that God was close by, right? Not distant, not on a cloud somewhere, but my grandmother's in the kitchen talking to Jesus like, Jesus just stopped over for some tea. And that just seemed perfectly normal to me. And so I had a glimpse of this idea that prayer is this communication with God. I didn't need someone else to be the intercessor for me. I could talk to God the way I would talk to a beloved friend. And that intimacy really, really is real. And it's a powerful construct to think about prayer, particularly because then I never had the notion of prayer treating God as an ATM, right? Which is I pray, God answers, or I ask, God delivers, or I request and God says no. That wasn't my sense of prayer. It was not transactional. My sense of prayer, even still to this day, is intimate conversation with someone who loves me and is close by.
Mm, it's beautiful. Yeah. And I love the simplicity of that. And it's so powerful. Yeah. Even though it's, I don't know, we make things so complicated, I think.
I think so. And I really did want to remove the transactional, because unfortunately, I think that's how a lot of times people think about prayer. And so they get really frustrated because they're like, my prayers are not being answered. But if I talk to my best friend, right? And he and I have a conversation, I'm expecting a transaction. I'm expecting to be heard, to be listened. I'm expecting to hear from her. I'm expecting when I hang up the phone just to feel that I've been loved and heard. So removing that transactional nature from prayer and focusing on the intimacy, the friendship, the closeness, the communication, the sense of being loved is a way to deal with people who are frustrated with prayer because they think that they should get something in return for it.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And I love also just the image of your grandmother as a kitchen mystic.
Yes, absolutely. Some stuff was happening in the kitchen. I mean, sometimes it just felt that was holy ground. You constitute the space as holy simply because God is present.
Yeah, beautiful.
You wrote, sometimes God's grace and our own growth are in leaving things behind. Tell us about the deconstruction process you went through, from growing up in a church that didn't even ordain women to being a highly educated, first in your family, maybe first and only for a long time. What was that in between like from the person you grew up to be, you were growing up, and the person that you are today, a theologian?
I love you using the term deconstruction, because certainly that's exactly what it is. I figured it out, which is that we don't have to abandon everything, even as we grow and occupy a different space. Women in my denomination weren't ordained. I am ordained. Women in many ways didn't occupy certain kinds of leadership roles. I'm the dean of a school. There were certain kinds of legalism, back to the hymn lines and skirts and such. There's a certain kind of legalism that was just absolutely pervasive. And that's real. I had to say, what is it that I keep and what is not for me? There were certain things that were not for me. The legalism was not for me. The very narrow path was not for me. And I had to leave those things behind. And leaving is very, very, very difficult. It didn't mean that I had to abandon everything. It meant that I had to make some decisions, the way that you renovate a house, right? Which is, what stuff do you get rid of and you knock down and it's gone forever? And what stuff, can be built on a good, firm, solid foundation, at a solid foundation. But I had to find a place for myself. I had to find a God that belonged to me. My grandmother taught me many things, my church mothers taught me many things, but at the end of the day, I had to work out my own soul salvation with fear and trembling. I really, really want to tell people that you can do the work of deconstruction. It is important work, but you can't stop at deconstruction. I didn't just tear down the things and say, none of that is for me. I leave this space behind. I said, what do I leave behind? And then what's the building, right? What's the renovation? What do I put on this foundation? And all of it requires grace. I mean, it requires grace, God's grace for us, but also grace that we were taught many, many things that I now disagree with, but I have grace because they taught what they knew. They gave me the best that they had. I am now a parent. I am doing the best I can by my daughter, but I'm making plenty of mistakes too. And she will recognize she made some mistakes, and yet she also loves me. So how do we have the grace to say, that can't come with me where I am, and also say, I appreciate what they did with what they had, and then move forward to something that belongs to you. That's the work of both deconstruction and then construction.
Love it. Thank you.
Yeah, and I wonder if you could, we were talking about the grace and the love that comes through the prayer, but then you also talk about how your grandmother talked about the midnight hour and those times when we have the doubts and the anxieties and the fear and the loneliness, and they all converge together. And so tell us more about this midnight hour and what you learned about how you grow more intimate with God in a place where God feels really far away sometimes.
When you grow up in a tradition like I grew up in, you weren't really allowed to ask many questions. But I was the kid with a lot of questions. And so I would be in Sunday school and the Sunday school teacher would say something. I was like, well, I don't know. And so finally they just kicked me out of Sunday school and sent me to be with the adults because I just asked a lot. And so what I realized about faith is that faith comes with questions and it comes with doubt. And it comes with a lot of, I just don't know. I often tell my students when I begin a class teaching them theology that one of the foundations of theology is simply to say, I don't know, right? And we're trying to figure this out together. And so I talk about midnight hours as sometimes those are places of crises, right? Everything's gone wrong. You've lost a loved one, you've lost a job. Like it just is a hard time. But sometimes the midnight hours are those spaces where your doubts, your fears, is this real? Is this true? Is God who God says God is? What does this all mean? And I just wanted to write about that, to say to people that doubt is not the opposite of faith, right? Faith encompasses doubt, that you can have doubts, that you can have questions. I have lots of questions for which I have absolutely no answers, and other theologians want to pretend, no, they don't know either. And that's okay, right? Like that's totally okay. But if you are coming from a space where you're always taught, don't ask questions, just believe, don't ask God, we don't question God. I was taught that we don't question God. I have some questions to God. And that's why I got into this business of questioning God. That's just essentially what I do for a living. But that's okay. And so in those midnight hours where either our doubts creep in, the pains of life, the realities of living in a fallen, broken world, and we just don't know, to say, you have to be in that place sometimes. That is the place. And it doesn't make you any less loved by God that you are in that.
Yeah, it's like such a big sigh of relief, to think, I mean, and I wasn't actually raised in a religious tradition, but when I got to be like a young adult, I still felt that sense of like, oh, doubt, when I started to feel doubts, particularly after my mom died, it was this heavy burden because it's, and I was studying theology and here I was, so, wrestling. I just have to say, I love the image of the dean of Howard Divinity School being kicked out of Sunday school.
Really well. He really was. They were like, please go away. I just had so many questions. A lot of it just didn't make any sense to me. I was just this really curious kid, and they were sick of me. And so now I understand it, because then you have a child of your own, and then they ask you questions every minute of the day, and you're like, oh,
I love it.
little
I love
payback.
it. Thank you for that. Lovely.
So I had this experience a few days ago, and I was in this conversation with a white man who's interested in me romantically. And somehow it came up that that I was once a battered woman. And he said, you should have called the police. Well, first of all, do not should on me, sir. But second, I said, you would have a very different perception of the police than I would. So I would like for you to share the story of the young man in your classroom who the police came for, and how you're still unpacking that story today.
Thank you. And thank you for sharing your experience. This is very, very powerful. So I've been in higher education my entire career, and have taught many, many students over the years. In this particular story, I was teaching at a predominantly white institution. I was teaching a very, very large survey class, so one of those big, big classes with a couple of hundred students in, the team of TAs, and I enjoy it. I really enjoyed teaching the freshmen. But at a predominantly white institution, I was certainly probably one of the first Black professors most of those students had, and there were very few African-American students in the class, including this one young Black man. And I noticed him. He was sitting in the front. We would talk. It was great. One day I was prepping for class, and police came by, and as students were filing in, and they told me that they were here to arrest this young Black man that was in my class. And I tell people the story because it's sort of now it was like an outer body experience, but all kinds of thoughts went through my head, which is that they were about to arrest this young Black man in front of a predominantly white classroom, put him in handcuffs, usher him to God knows where, and I didn't want that to happen in this space that I had cultivated, this safe space for these students. And I don't know where the courage or the foolishness maybe came from, but I told them, I'm about to teach this class and you have to wait. And I went in the classroom, and I had a young African-American male TA, and he stood like a deacon at the door, and I taught this class. And I don't even know how I got through the class, but as the students were filing out the young man they were there to arrest, I called them and I told them, I said, they are here to arrest you. I want you to know they came at the beginning of class. I didn't want you to be handcuffed in front of your friends, and let's wait. And we waited until everybody left, right? By the time I got into the hallway, the police were there, the department chair was there. Like, it was clear, they were either coming to get me, him, I don't know, really. I think about that quite a bit, because I felt his shame. I felt shame. I felt frustration. I felt helplessness. I wish there were more I could have done. I did what I could have done, which was I just wanted to spare him the indignity of being arrested in front of his friends. Was there more I could have done, should have said? I don't know. And I never found out what happened to him or where he went or what has become of his life. But that stays with me because the experience of Black bodies being handcuffed, being led away in police car, whatever he did, or if he didn't do it, but to be criminalized at 18 in front of all your classmates, and I'm standing there and I don't want to be a part of this process, and how can I protect him, and how can I help him? And so it's an example of how race and racism enters into the daily decisions that we make. It enters into how I teach and what I do and where I go and how I carry myself when I go to a store and whether I bring my pocketbook or not, or whether I bring a bag or not. That part of what the larger white world doesn't understand is how race factors into every decision, everything, and the weight of that sometimes that feels incredibly heavy. But I just think about that young man from time to time and what his story is. I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think of everything from when I go to the store, and we do know when we're being profiled because it's been happening forever.
Yeah.
But, can I drive in this neighborhood, after dark? And can I buy a home in this area? That we are making decisions constantly
Yes.
because of the color of our skin, that people may not know that we are constantly having to negotiate. So
Absolutely.
I really appreciate you sharing that story. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, and connected to all of that, I really appreciated this story you shared about you driving and seeing the white woman by the side of the road and the terrible weather. And, and this privilege of not having to think about your race and contemplating these daily decisions. And I just thought that performance that you have to undergo all the time sounds so exhausting. And I just wondered, what are the resources that help you to take care of yourself in that ongoing way? Because it sounds absolutely exhausting. Yeah.
Oh, it's absolutely exhausting. You're just making these like micro calculations constantly, right? It's almost like you're computing just where, what, when, how, read, and so it is. So one of the things people talk a lot about is self-care. And a lot of times I'll get asked, like, as the dean of a school or minister or whatever, like, what do you do for self-care? So here's the answer. I really don't do anything for self-care. I'm really busy. I have to be really, really honest about that. And so people like, do you take a bath and aromatherapy? Yeah, I don't do any of that. But I love that people do that, and I think that's wonderful. But what I can say, which I think is true to the tradition in which I was raised, is that my sense of community care is very high, which is that you have to have a community. You self-care is what the individual can do, right? I can take the bath, I can do a little retail therapy, I can, do a little, but community care is, there are people who have my back. There is a community that's looking out for me and loves me. And so I fail on the self-care register, but in terms of the communities of care, I have cultivated them, and those are friendships with people far and near, and those communities really sustain me. They give me a sense of purpose. They give me a sense of, you know what, you're gonna be okay, and this is a loss right now, but you're gonna be okay. And so I encourage everyone while they're doing the self-care to also make sure you're cultivating communities of care.
Yeah, I love that. So to maybe take a bath, but then make sure to call your friend.
Right. Time I take a bath, I would be sitting there frustrated and doing emails. So so you just have to know who you are, right?
Yeah.
And I love all the ideas about self-care, and there are books about self-care, and I read them, and I'm like, wow, that sounds really great. And also, yeah, I'm not going to do that. But you find, what's significant for you. For some people, that is being in community and fellowship in a religious space and setting. For other people, it's just regular lunch times or walks with friends. But we are not alone, and we are not meant to be alone in this world.
So beautiful. Thank you for that. Yeah.
Chapter 8, you say, when I am spiritually and physically well, and when I am spiritually and physically safe, I have a responsibility to work so other communities can also be safe and whole. Could you unpack that for us, please?
So in theology, we often talk about soteriology, and soteriology is the study of salvation. We under what circumstances is a person saved. We use the story of Nicodemus who comes to Jesus and asks Jesus, what must I do to be saved? And so these questions of spiritual salvation are really crucial to theology, right? What happens to us when we die? And so I was thinking a lot about salvation, because that was a very big deal. Growing up, hearing about salvation and being saved, and my grandmother and the church mothers passing out tracts, people on the street, because they want you to know this is what you need to do to be saved. The Great Commission, they really believed in that. But I think that salvation without safety is empty, and so safety, that root word for both salvation and safety, it is the same. And so how am I safe? How are Black women safe? Because you need to be safe before the question of spiritual salvation comes up. It's the way that we say here in the US where there are food deserts. Like, you want children to learn, they have to not be hungry, right? And so if you want people to really take seriously soteriology and eschatology and all of these other ologies that are part of theology, they need to feel safe. Where are places of safety? Where are places of refuge? Where are places where we feel loved and affirmed? And I think there are very few places, to be perfectly honest. And so I want to have the conversation about safety. When I am whole and well, then I can love others and help them to be whole and well. But when I am broken and unsafe and under threat and feeling violated and feeling in danger, then all of this religious language is meaningless. It really is. You attend to people's real needs, their physical needs, their psychological needs, and the spiritual follows.
It just makes me so amazed at our enslaved ancestors, how they were able to worship and love God in the most awful, horrific conditions. It's, one of my favorite books is Beloved.
Mine too, Beloved.
Baby Suggs' sermon at the clearing.
Your flesh.
Yes, and yonder, they hate our flesh. And I mean, and it's not as it was during chattel slavery, but it's certainly, our flesh is still hated. And, to have God at all, I just think shows such magnificent resilience and grace and things I don't even have language to describe.
Oh, it's beautiful. I don't have the right language either, but I know when I was when you get to the place where you're old enough to try to figure out who you are and what you believe, I distinctly remember thinking through this. The faith that sustained my ancestors on those ships, the faith that sustained them through lynching, through Jim and Jane Crow, the faith that sustained them on a voyage to a place that they could not imagine, to a circumstance and a situation of slavery for life, the faith they had even at the auction block. That faith, my ancestors' faith, I am not willing to abandon it or yield it to someone else. And that is why I do the work that I do. In the United States, you often hear conversations about religion that are dominated by the most conservative theological voices, the most conservative political voices, as if somehow this faith, this Christianity, this God belongs to them. It does not belong to them. And I want it to be a part of the conversation. And to do that was me refusing to yield this faith to these other voices. This is my ancestors' faith, and it helped them to survive, and I will not yield it. It belongs to me. It is my tradition, and I am a proud part of it. And so everyone has to find their own path, and I encourage people to find their own path. But as for me, this faith that sustained those folks on the boat, including the ones who jumped off the boat, that is the faith that I have inherited. And it is the faith that I want to leave for the next generation.
So important when we've got mega churches and people, gauging our spirituality by how much money we have, or the $5,000 suits and cars and private airplanes, so far away from what our ancestors had to cling to on those ships in this new land that was wholly unfamiliar and wholly hostile. That's don't get me started.
That's where we are. That's where we are. Absolutely.
Yeah. You talk about in your chapter on being present about how theology really takes place in worship in a communal context. It's not just an intellectual exercise that might come at some point later, but it really starts in that worship. And you talk about how some of these songs, were so formative for you and shaping your understanding of the divine. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about that and the role of music in helping you, become a theologian.
Yeah, it's you don't even realize you're learning music when you're learning. It's just the songs get sung again and again and again, and so you in your head. But to this day, I love hymns. I heard hymns growing up. I heard all of the verses too, not just the first verse or the refrain, but all of the verses. I just constantly there was music around, music about faith and God and Jesus, and I absorbed all of it. And why I love it, I think it's like the African proverb that talks about the spirit will not descend without a song. And so these songs, this music from the spirituals to the hymns, they were infused with theological significance for me. There were times, and now I understand that there were times where the church mothers, where they would get up to give a testimony and they couldn't speak, but they would sing or they would hum, or like Mona's song. There was something about how we believe that the Holy Spirit can make intercession. And even when we can't quite verbalize it with the words. And so music was so formative, these songs, these hymns. I really lament the loss of the hymnody, of the hymnal tradition. Many of our churches, particularly in the African American context, have gone to praise and worship. And praise and worship is beautiful. But these hymns, they did a work, and I'm not sure that a lot of contemporary music does this kind of work. And so in those midnight hours, worship song, I'm thinking about that old rugged cross, or I'm thinking about I surrender all, like, and it's echoing the same way that scripture echoes, because you have read it again and again and again. But I think music is so crucial and central and vital for the operation of faith. We do more theology in our music than we do any other kind of way. It teaches us more. We learn more through it. But yeah, I'm lamenting the fact that we're not singing that many hymns anymore in our churches.
Yeah, it makes me curious. I have a love of Saint Hildegard of Bingen, the medieval Benedictine abbess.
Yeah.
And she writes a lot about, she writes a lot of music herself, but she writes about how the human singing is essentially a way of reconnecting us with the divine realm and with the singing of the angels, and how we couldn't even bear the pure voice of the angels in its full glory. So I wonder if there's any of that kind of theological sort of understanding of like the song actually entering us into that intimacy with the divine. And
I love that. Yeah. I love the medieval women mystics. I love that they were so focused on this notion of communion. and not the Eucharist, but actual communion with God. And so it was the song, it was the music, it was the idea of the song as an offering, right?
Yeah.
And that it would go up to God. And so the ways in which some traditions that use the incense, right, that fragrance is an offering. And so the music was an offering, and I heard a lot of music, again, songs, and someone would start the song and someone would pick up the song, and sometimes it's fast and sometimes it's slow, but it was this careful attention to how the spirit was moving. So sometimes it was hand clapping, foot stomping, excitement and worship, and sometimes it was just slow and melodic, but paying attention to what is God doing in this space. And I think music allows you to do that really beautifully.
Thank you for unpacking that a bit. Yeah, beautiful.
And St. Augustine said, "He who sings prays twice."
Yes, love it.
A quote, "To be present in worship is to bring our full selves into the process." What does being fully present in worship experience look like for you these days?
When I went to graduate school and college, and I went to various houses of worship with many of my friends, and I was really intrigued by how, for many people, this was an all intellectual experience. It was all about the head, right? It was all the neck up, right? Their thoughts and ideas and what they were reading. And I'm just like, where's the rest of you, right? So what I love about the holiness Pentecostal tradition in which I was raised was that you had to be fully present. It was the body, it was the hand clapping and the shouting, it was the tearing, it was the kneeling, it was the getting up and the sitting down. It was, when I was little, the falling asleep and the waking up. It was all of that. And that's what I think I mean by to be present. It is to show up with one's full self. I know God and believe in God, and yes, that's an intellectual exercise for me. But sometimes God shows up in ways that are tangible and physical, in ways that are visceral, and we have to be open to this full experience, this full presence. Yeah, I mentioned incense earlier. Growing up, we had a kitchen in the basement of our church. This is really traditional in most African American churches. And at a certain point, the smell of fried chicken would waft up to the sanctuary. And, we were just like, the preacher would be preaching, the pastor would be preaching, and we was like, okay, I hope he's wrapping it up, because we could smell that the food was almost ready, because we would stay and have an afternoon meal in the church. And that felt sacred to me. When my grandmother would make lemon pound cake for neighbors, or she would make sweet potato pies and visit the sick and shut in, the smell of that, even to this day, is when I make the pies, that's sacred to me. And so we show up with our full selves. God didn't make floating heads. God gave us bodies, and those bodies are distinct, right? Those bodies have color and texture and size. And because I don't believe God makes mistakes, I get to show up in the fullness of my Black woman body. I get to show up with the fullness of myself, whether it's smells or sounds or singing or dancing or clapping. Sometimes it is just sitting quietly and thinking and praying and being reflective. But bring your full self, whatever that really means to you. I'm very, very nervous about traditions that don't allow people to bring their full self in, because I'm like, why did God make you the way that you are? Right? It's like it's just all these little floating heads somewhere, right? But instead, we have these bodies, and they are temples. And so that's why the beauty of our difference is so important, because this is the temple of God.
If I may read this really quick passage from Beloved, Baby Suggs' sermon. Then she shouted, she had just gathered the people at the clearing. Then she shouted, "Let the children come," and they ran from the trees toward her. "Let your mothers hear you laugh," she told them, and the woods rang. The adults looked on and could not help smiling. "Then let the grown men come," she shouted. They stepped out one by one from among the ringing trees. Let your wives and your children see you dance, she told them, and ground life shuddered under their feet. Finally, she called the women to her. Cry, she told them, for the living and the dead, just cry. And without covering their eyes, the women let loose. It started that way. Laughing children, dancing men, crying women, and then it all got mixed up. Women stopped crying and danced. Men sat down and cried, children danced, women laughed, children cried until exhausted and riven, all and each lay about the clearing, damp and gasping for breath. That is so reminiscent of a Black church experience where you get this full-bodied experience. It's not like a floating head. It's not an intellectual, even though your intellect is involved, it's not an intellectual exercise. It is embodied. And I love that about the Black church. When I go, I go to a Black Catholic church. And I love the Black Catholic Church because it has the things that I love, like the Eucharist. But it also has the exact same songs that some of them are the Negro spirituals from, centuries ago. The things that the songs that our enslaved ancestors used as code, but also songs that they used to keep them going.
Yeah. Absolutely. I love that. So I love the passage that you just read from Morrison's Beloved. I was very, very fortunate to have been one of her students when I was an undergraduate. And words really fail to sort of say how significant it meant to have her as a teacher. I'm thinking about this embodiment all the time. As Christians, particularly if you're a Trinitarian Christian, you believe that at some point, God took on flesh, right? At some point in the form of a baby, right? God takes on flesh, the incarnate God that we believe walked this earth in the body of Jesus, like literally walk the earth, experience all that there was to experience in life, was loved, had a community, had a family, had friends, And so if God takes on flesh, right, then flesh can be holy. Right? And that embodiment, that incarnational nature of the divine is absolutely critical. And we have a model of that in the presence of this little infant child, the divine one, humbled divine self, right? And so I love the notion of embodiment because it means that unlike the kind of Pauline crucify the flesh, right? What Toni Morrison says in that very passage that you read, which is that all of these people are telling you to crucify the flesh, but here we're going to love it. They want to noose you, they want to lynch you, they want to harm your flesh. But in this place, she says, we're going to love your hands and your neck and your back and your feet, and we're going to love this flesh. And I believe that is theologically true to God's word, to take on flesh, to love the flesh that was God incarnate, and to say, I created that, and you get to love the temple of God. So it's beautiful.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much.
And I think that is a perfectly beautiful place to bring our conversation to a close. I've so enjoyed this. I highly recommend this book, In My Grandmother's House, Black Women, Faith, and the Stories We Inherit. I think anyone can enjoy this book and have it, break open new ideas for you. And I love theology through storytelling, which you do so beautifully. So thank you, Dean. It's been wonderful to have you here with us. So
thank you both for making the time to chat with me. It's just been wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.